conversation with someone this week. They shared with me, it's an acquaintance of mine, and they shared with me one of their deepest fears. And I asked if I could talk about it a little bit on Sunday, and they were okay with that. They were flying home this weekend to visit family, and they have a fear of tight spaces. They're claustrophobic. And in order to fly home, you have to do what? Get in an enclosed space. And so part of their preparation over several months has actually been desensitizing themselves, getting ready for this airplane flight. Now, I suspect each of us have particular fears. Some may not like spiders or snakes, but if you remember that song, but that isn't what it takes. You know the rest of the song. Some of you are afraid of mice. If a mouse came into I was thinking about this because I was driving around Pickering the other day and I happened to see, it was early on, I was doing a workout, and there was a mouse running across the pathway. Some don't like fear of heights. How about fear of speaking in public? Yeah, that's right. We've all got these particular fears. And this morning I want to talk about the relationship between fear and faith as we see articulated in Matthew or in Mark chapter 5. And in Mark's gospel, he set his gospel up in a way to show us signs pointing to who Jesus is. Each of the stories in the Gospel of Mark tells you something about who Jesus is and his ministry and purpose. And in chapter 5, we get two significant stories where faith and fear both play very significant roles. Now, we have our particular fears, but we live in a country with religious freedom. Not everyone has that privilege. I saw an email from Andrew White, who's known as the Vicar of Baghdad. He serves in St. George's Anglican Church in Baghdad in Iraq, where they're faced with other problems. The kidnapping of people and execution of people, particularly minority groups, is a significant issue in that country after the collapse of the government. And Andrew Barron, Canon White, writes this. He called it Day of Tears. Well, today has been awful. For 2 years, we've worked every day on getting the two Jasons back. They were my friends. I ate with them and lived with them. These people were not just hostages, they were my friends. Every day I prayed for them and sought their release. I confess that once the news was confirmed about their killing, I cried. I cannot imagine the pain of their dear families, how terrible it must be for them, and how we pray for them. As I was in tears, I was trying to prepare for our Sunday service. Church was great as usual, and people are also nice and so encouraging. Together we shared our pain and love. As was the case with the Apostle Paul, there were many tears, yet Andrew continued to proclaim the gospel in the power of the Spirit. See, our brothers and sisters in other places have different fears. How about this email which I received, and I brought it in. I've been praying for these children this week. There's a picture of a particular child from Kenya with this description. I'm going to change his name. This is Edward Jr. He is in class 5. He is 12 years old. He lives with his mother because his father died some years back. He is the second born in a family of 4. They live within the slums of Kibera, and the mother does a small business of selling tomatoes to sustain the family, which at times is not enough to cater for the needs of the family. Benedict is a bright child who can perform better if given an opportunity to be in school. So in this case, this particular family in Kibera, their fear is, how do I pay to educate my children so they have a future? And many of the women who work very hard in Kibera, single parents and otherwise, try to get by on $1 US a day to feed, clothe, and educate their children. You see, their fears are very real. and we have our fears too. So let's take a look at what Jesus says about the role of faith and fear in our gospel reading from Mark chapter 5. Jesus comes back to Capernaum, which is his ministry base. It's a major town, and it was quite important because it sits on the Sea of Galilee, but it was on the border between 3 tax districts. And so tax collectors like the disciple Matthew were employed there. They would sit there in Capernaum and collect taxes as you cross from one boundary to another. It was a great place to make money. And as you know, governments love to do what? Tax you. Now, it's one thing when you actually receive benefit from your taxes, but can you imagine being in a society where you pay taxes on everything but receive no benefit? And so Capernaum produced people with great wealth and a lot of grumbling people who are just trying to get by. And in the midst of this situation, we have a synagogue, which actually was quite prosperous in the time of Jesus because money from generous benefactors who benefited from the tax system supported the synagogue. And for those of you who've been to Capernaum, you know that the second century synagogue is built on the one, right on the one of Jesus' day. And this small winding streets that really are just big enough for 2 people to stand shoulder to shoulder, wind through the streets leading to the synagogue. And Orthodox Jews would always live within walking distance for a Sabbath day of the synagogue, so that you didn't break the Sabbath law when the Sabbath came, and you had to walk to worship. So it wasn't considered work. You honored the law in that way. And each synagogue had 12 or more elders, equivalent to wardens. So the role of Mike and Pam and our deputy wardens, they're really this is you in this story. Because the elders of the synagogue or the rulers of the synagogue looked after the administration of the synagogue. The synagogue was not just a place for worship, but they did actually very much like we do here at St. Paul's. They had a food bank. They provided hospitality. They provided support for the poor in the community in Capernaum, just as St. Paul's does. It performs many of the same functions, and they needed good administrators who carried great respect in the community to oversee this work. Now, Jesus had already criticized some of the religious leaders of his day and had become something of a radical personality in Capernaum. Many of the Orthodox would not want to go too close to him because his ideas were considered quite extreme or radical. And so for Jairus to actually come and spend time with Jesus caused him to overcome his fears of what? What other people would think about him. How many of you have been in situations where you've actually not done something because, and it could be something good, I'm not just talking about something bad, but you've not done something good because of the fear of what? What other people might say. Peer pressure is a significant social a system for keeping people in line in every society. And Jairus would have been very concerned about being seen with Jesus because he was connected with criticizing some of the Jewish leaders in his community. It's not good for business in one real sense or for your reputation, but what is it that drives him? There are 2 great fears people carry. One is the fear of death, and the other is the fear of sickness, particularly chronic illness. And we see both those articulated in our reading this morning. What drives Jairus to seek out Jesus is that his daughter is terminally ill. She's gone from that stage of being sick to, I call it the death rattle, where they're getting the heavy breathing, the 12-year-old. Many of you have been through this with small children. You've been very concerned, maybe you've rushed them to the hospital or medical clinic because you've been very concerned that they've reached a really critical point, very high temperature. And in a time of no antibiotics, I'm actually one of those people who probably would not be here without antibiotics. I got a version of rheumatic fever as a young teenager. Without the proper treatments, there was a good chance that would have progressed and might have become fatal. as it was for many people who were before the time of antibiotics. If you go to any cemetery in Pickering, look at the number of graves from 1919. What happened in 1919? The Spanish flu epidemic. And it killed a lot of seniors and young children in particular. And you'll see that articulated. Sorry? I know, that's some stuff. Part of my interest in this topic is I spend a lot of time in places where those diseases were virulent or still exist. And so without antibiotics, it killed millions and millions of people around the world. And we take it for granted that you can take an antibiotic and get better. But in a time where you don't have that, you'll see it articulated in books like Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility, for those of you who read it. Someone goes out in the rain to get a chill, and it actually can become quite fatal. One famous composer actually died when he dropped his wooden baton in a practice, and it fell point down and hit him in the foot. And the foot became infected, no antibiotics, he died. You might know Vivaldi on the Four Seasons. Bad things can happen to you quite quickly if you don't have antibiotics. And that was the case in Jesus' day. So Jairus is desperate. He loves his daughter so much that he'll do anything, even sacrifice his personal reputation, to at least have a chance. So he goes to Jesus believing that if only the Lord Jesus can see his daughter before she dies, that there's a chance of hope and healing, because he's heard Jesus been able to heal the blind man, people with leprosy, people with serious mental health issues and in need of exorcism. And that reputation has spread. And so he comes and gets Jesus and begs him to come to his house to pray for his daughter. And on the way to his house would have been walking distance through these narrow walkways, and have actually walked through the same areas that Jesus likely walked through. And for those of you who've been in Capernaum, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Those small walkways between I call it the Flying Saucer Church, which is built over the archaeological ruins, and into where the synagogue is. And so he's going along, and as he goes along, Mark tells us another story about someone who was chronically ill and desperate. In Jesus' day, because of purity laws, if you had a problem with bleeding, you were considered impure. If you were considered impure, you could not touch another Orthodox Jew, man or woman. If you did, they were considered defiled and could not go to the temple. There were a lot of things they could not do. And this woman had had a problem with chronic bleeding for years. And what's worse, she'd gone to doctors and been constantly frustrated. Now, we know some of the treatments she was probably exposed to. There is something called sympathetic medicine. The belief that if, for example, you ground up a red powdered substance, and the red looks like blood, that if you drank that substance, for example, we have this as an ancient recipe, we found it in archaeological records. This was an actual treatment. A ground up substance, red in color, was a mineral base, and you drink it, that this will provide healing. In the time of the 18th century, where you had a huge problem with syphilis, people would often take large amounts of very poisonous chemicals to try and heal themselves. In fact, one of the beauty treatments that often was fatal to women was an attempt to get a very white complexion, which was considered very beautiful. And so they would put a chemical base on their face, which had a very high lead content. And we know that there were several very powerful women who died of lead poisoning because they constantly were exposing themselves to these things. So sympathetic treatments for beauty or for medical care were very fatal. And in fact, some may have even encountered snake oil medicine. You can sometimes get it, some of the products are sold actually on television. I won't mention who, but you could think of the commercials. And you'll see if you read the little fine print underneath, it will say there's no actual scientific proof that's not approved by the FDA for treatment. They're just telling you that this can do something for you. And this woman had gone for treatment and spent all her money and not seen any improvement. She was absolutely desperate because her particular condition meant that she was almost like having leprosy. You could not be with anyone. You could not pass something to anyone unless it was stone, because you would defile them. You were considered impure permanently, totally isolated from people that she might love and want to be in relationship with. And she hears about Jesus coming, and she thinks to herself, even if I could touch his cloak, I might be healed. And so she does something that she knows if she's caught is going to have serious repercussions. She jumps into the crowd and touches his cloak as there are all sorts of people in these small alleyways, and they're proceeding to Jairus' house. Now, when Jesus says, I'm going to come to your house to heal your daughter, and you're in part of the crowd, what's your reaction? I got to see this. It's like trying to get into a door crasher special on Black Friday. I'm not joking. The people would have gathered around, they would have been pushing around, they want to be there to see this miracle happen. Because how often do miracles happen? Not very often. And here you are, you're at ground zero for the potential healing of Jairus' daughter. And so people are intrigued and fascinated, and they're pushing in behind. And then the woman touches Jesus, and he feels the healing power go out of him, and he turns around, and he says something that stuns his disciples. Who touched me? And how do you know the scripture account is clear and true? Because the reaction of the disciples are exactly what I'd say. Jesus, you're surrounded by all these people. What do you mean, who touched you? There are about, 150 people touching you as you're going through we can't avoid it in a small walkway. But that's not what he's getting at. He's trying to encourage the woman who was healed to own the healing and recognize that it's her faith in God which leads to the healing. Her willingness to step out and trust God when everything else has failed. And so she works up the courage to come forward and says, it was me. Now notice that Jesus does not embarrass her and doesn't chastise her. He points out to her, go, your faith has made you well. You're healed. It's a story of God's and Jesus' love and compassion for us in the middle of our illness. And it would have meant a lot to the early church that were faced with all sorts of chronic diseases. But the story doesn't end. It continues on because just after this stop, other people come from Jairus' house with the news, his daughter has died. And there's weeping. Can you imagine Jairus' heart so filled with expectation? And you've got to wonder if he was also perhaps filled with a little anger. If only that woman hadn't stopped Jesus. Maybe if he'd been faster. Maybe if he just got there. Have you ever asked yourself all those maybe questions? Something's happened and you said, oh, if only I'd done X or Y, maybe it would have been different. And Jairus is just starting to weep. His heart's broken. And then Jesus says something which amazes Jairus and the crowd. Don't worry. Take me to your house. She's only sleeping. Now, the people of Jesus' day knew when someone was dead. And so the reaction is one that's quite natural. What do they start doing? Do they say, oh, that's nice. We can't wait to see a miracle. It's going to be fantastic. No. They're saying, they break out laughing. She's dead. Nobody can raise somebody who's dead. You might be a miracle worker, Jesus, for somebody who's alive, but no one's ever raised someone who's dead, except as far as some stories in the Torah, where God did some very special things. And Jesus takes Jairus and close members of the families and just a few of his disciples, and they go into the house, and he prays for her. And the tears are coming down Jairus' face. You could feel the drips probably just coming on the dirt on the floor. He's probably on his knees. And the little girl gets up and breathes. And there's gasps. For the early church, which experienced persecution and was confronted by the reality of being poor and faced with chronic disease and with the reality of dying, often as martyrs for their faith. These stories carried great power because they reminded them that in spite of everything that might happen to them, God would never forsake nor leave them. As Jesus said, I will be with you in whatever situation to the end of the age. Even when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, what? I won't leave nor forsake you. My rod and my staff will comfort you. What a great promise. Now, I did start with the stories of the children for a very particular reason. You see, one of the things that knowing about God's love for us and his call to love other people and to step out in faith means we do things we might not normally do. And so the reason I quoted these stories, and I have pictures of 10 students coming from Kibera slum. Those 10 young people, all with stories like the one I just read, who have no hope of education because they don't have money for school fees. There were some benefactors in this congregation who raised money. And one of the things I did when I was in Jerusalem was give money to the bishop overseeing this program so that those students will now be able to go to school. So the story doesn't end here. The story is they couldn't afford to send them to school. The story now is someone you don't know in a place called St. Paul's Pickering gave money so that you can have books and school fees and clothing and a future. Faith and fear. Faith wins.